it's much more about sending a signal about who you want to support. And in 2016, I thought, and in 2016, third parties did much better. So I think there was a chance to show a more specific signal that way. In 2020, it was just a much more Trump versus Biden race. And I had a preference there for Joe Biden. So I just decided to send a signal like that. I figured the better Joe Biden does in West Virginia, the more positive, the more negative message against Trump. Probably what I was looking for.
Now we're going to get into a bit more of a discussion just about some specific topics. One thing that has been brought up already is the prospect or the potential of court packing by Democrats in this upcoming term. While that has certainly not been a platform and really has not been a major talking point throughout the election, there has certainly been speculation about that potential. So, Alexandra, I know you had a comment on this topic.
Yeah, I guess as the lone law student, I should try to put this two-thirds completed JD to use. So to Tate's earlier question and point about hoping that court packing doesn't turn into a tit-for-tat situation, I think that's an incredibly valid concern, especially given what I view as the culture of Congress right now. But I will just say that there is a precedent, so to speak, for this. In 1876, the federal judiciary was expanded by adding more appellate level circuit courts. And so they added more justices to the bench to match that number. And that's how we got from 7 to 9. There are currently 13 federal appellate circuits. So there is a pathway legitimately, if there was enough of a coalition within Congress to actually either put in an amendment or draft some new language to the Constitution, to Article 3, there is a pathway for saying, like, we will expand the court by 2 more members to match the federal appellate judiciary. That's perhaps the most legitimate way. Will that actually happen? That remains to be seen. But that is something that if Democrats wanted to galvanize around and really use American constitutional history to their benefit, they could absolutely do.
So, Alexandra, to follow up from that, is it your view then that if it were to happen in the coming 4 years, that to Tate's concern, it would not turn into a regular policy topic regarding every election?
Yeah, I think the only way to get around that is to put something in the Constitution, whether we add an amendment, whether we add titles to Article 3, which is the section that's about the federal judiciary. Because I agree, it becomes very back and forth and it can be very petty. And that's not what anyone wants. The Supreme Court is supposed to be independent, apolitical, and is not supposed to bend to the whim of either party, whoever's controlling Congress or the White House. So that is perhaps the most legitimate way you could secure an expanded court that is locked into a certain number. However, maybe that would change in the future if DC becomes a state, if Puerto Rico becomes a state, and representation changes. Does the federal judiciary expand? Is that something that comes up? That might be the most stable way to change it, but it absolutely could be a battleground, just like everything else we've seen in the last 50 to 70 years of American politics.
There's been a great deal of discussion about how to most effectively carry out an election given the current pandemic. Do any of you have concerns about the integrity of the election? And if so, what would you have liked to have seen been done differently?
I don't know integrity of the election. I'm more worried about maybe Donald Trump's reaction to what I see as a more likely Joe Biden victory. I think that he's going to use maybe the kind of nature of voting this year with more early and mail-in ballots as a way to contest. So I think in terms of that, it's easier to contest an election. It's easier to claim fraud when we have more mail-in ballots, more early voting versus like I would prefer just, 1 day voting and then we kind of know the results by whatever midnight, 11 p.m., whatever time it is. So I just think it creates an environment that makes it easier for Joe Biden or Donald Trump to contest, which I don't think is necessarily good. I imagine this thing's going to go to the courts and we're going to not really have an answer for numerous amount of weeks, which is probably not the best thing for the country as a whole. But in terms of actually integrity of, are these mail-in ballots right versus wrong? I don't think there's really material issues there.
Will?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the mail-in ballots were not able to be counted, at least in some areas of some key states, until election day itself, which essentially prolongs the election a great deal. And some of the mail-in ballots postmarked by November 3rd legally have to be counted. So this automatically sets up the situation that we have now, where the election stretches on, well, people are talking about it stretching on a further week. So I think, as Tate said, that allows for Donald Trump to claim that the election has been a fraud, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, people to claim that there's a number of different tactics being used to try to steal the election. A number of Donald Trump's tweets have been blocked by Twitter last night and this morning. So I think that it's really dangerous to have mail-in voting where we don't know the results of the election for such a long period of time. I would have liked them to be counted much earlier.
Rachel, what are your thoughts?
I think that I guess want to defend mail-in voting here for a second. I mean, I do think that there are legitimate health concerns that prohibit people from being in rooms of large people right now, and those are valid enough to allow for mail-in voting. And then this sort of fact that it takes longer to vote, I'm not quite sure why this conclusion is being drawn that the time it takes to decide an election is an inherently poor thing. I mean, the president would not in theory change until mid-January. I mean, it's, frustrating as it is for me, for other people, to have this sort of thing drag on. But in the long run, I mean, it doesn't really matter. I would hope to think that we'd prefer the sort of accuracy and allow the most amount of people to vote possible in order to actually get that. I mean, the problematic element of this is the court challenging, which I guess we've seen so far even before any of these mail-in votes are probably accounted for. But I think the problematic elements for why mail-in voting are bad is not the actual time that it takes for them to be counted, but that it's the way that it allows conservatives to challenge them in the courts later on, which is two meaningfully different things that should be addressed separately, I think.
Andrea, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with Rachel and Will. I think I am a little bewildered somewhat by the controversy on mail-in voting. There's been the amount of fraud that has been detected on mail-in voting has been just statistically insignificant, basically. So it is not a legitimate concern, I believe. But I think particularly this year, I think everyone should not be shocked by the timing of it, right? Due to legitimate health concerns, particularly in many states that are now seeing cases increase as part of this third wave, voted by mail, made the right decision to vote by mail if they felt that was the safest choice. Maybe they were too far from a polling station or from a drop-off location, and that's fair. I think I again, like Rachel and Will, don't understand why there's so much rush into this idea that we need to know the results today. Obviously we want to know as soon as possible, but I think this notion we've gotten used to getting the results within a day, it is not, normal circumstances, and we have to come to terms with that. I think what's most concerning to me right now is that many are taking the opportunity to just go to courts right away and try to delegitimize valid ballots from seniors or from people that just did not feel safe enough to do in-person voting. So I'll say I don't regret that people didn't go in person, because that would have been, I think, very impactful for the health and the number of cases that we have currently in the US. But I am extremely concerned about this fight that is going to end up in the courts very likely, and the fact that there's no safeguard around that due to just the legitimate reasons behind the huge mail-in voting this year.
Jay, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Rachel that legally speaking, there's no reason why we have to have this done the night of the election. I mean, I think it's December 8th is when the Electoral College has to decide. So they can take not a huge amount of time, but they have days and weeks to make sure that they actually get it accurate. I do think there's a problem with expectations though, where because in elections past since basically 2000, we have this sort of election night theater, almost like a game show where everybody watches and sees what happens and expects that there's going to be a result. I think that's what opened the door for Donald Trump's speech, which I think was very clearly trying to take advantage of that and try to even though, votes are, I think in every election, votes are still counted afterwards. It's just we have an idea of who's going to win regardless of how they're counted. He took advantage of that to try to say, well, counting after the election, that that's not supposed to happen, right? So obviously I should be winning at this point. And I think that that is a problem.
I'll just say really quickly, I know the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, I think, just jumped off of a press conference as we're having this conversation. And I'm very interested to see, because the right to govern elections lies with the states. So I'm very interested to see what the state secretaries of state and the state governors are going to do in the coming days to defend the will of the electorate. And I think that the bulk of the responsibility lies with them.
Great. So that's a great segue to our next topic, which actually ties in a lot to everything you guys have been talking about so far, which is that in the last couple months, this process of Amy Coney Barrett getting nominated and confirmed was especially contentious given what happened 4 years earlier. It's murky as to how and why these individual state election results would go to the Supreme Court. But if there is a case that ends up in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, are you concerned about the impartiality of a newly confirmed judge? And do you think she should recuse herself if this were to happen?
I think she should recuse herself. It's too early. And I think any result that if she was the deciding factor would be, oh my gosh, the country would go absolutely nuts. But other than that, no, I'm pretty confident in the court's ability to rule on something impartial. But I still think she would need to recuse herself just because I just don't think it makes sense. It's too soon.
Jay?
From sort of a almost like political realist perspective, I would say she should probably recuse herself depending on how it's going to go. If it looks like, if the case is pretty obvious and the court is planning to go in favor of Joe Biden, she may want to not recuse herself because then that builds up the legitimacy. Like even the person Trump just appointed is agreeing with the rest of the court that he's wrong in this case. I think it would be pretty bad either way for a Bush v. Gore type of situation, but she may want to recuse herself in that case if it's something that's pretty close and controversial.
Alexander, did you have a comment on that?
I was just going to jump in to say that I agree with Tate and Jay. I think she should recuse herself, but I also am more concerned about the voting rights precedent that the court has built up over time, especially since Shelby v. Holder, and given the opinions that came out about Vermont with Kavanaugh and the Wisconsin, and knowing how firmly the Supreme Court holds to its own precedent, I'm more concerned about that having an impact on any future litigation, slightly more so than a recusal or non-recusal by Barrett.
Can I add one thing? It's not to that point. It's just like, I think it's very important for Republicans to start planning for 2024. I think, like I mentioned earlier, that the election, I think, is a win for them, even though Trump lost. So I think prominent Republican leaders, Mitch McConnell, others should probably distance themselves away from a challenge as just like political strategy to prepare for 2024. So I think they should distance themselves away from Trump and probably lean more towards what we're going to see as like actual election results.
All right. So Tate, thank you. Another great segue into our next topic, which is, regardless of the outcome of this election, where do you hope to see the party that you support or just the overall party system in general move in the next 4 years?
If you ask me straight, like where I would want to see how the party system, like get rid of it, right? Like you get rid of it, you get rid of the extremism that I think is kind of running our country. Obviously that's not going to happen. So that being said, what would I want to see from the Republican Party? They got to make way on minority voters, right? Like you're not going to win being the vote of the white man. We saw that a little with Latino voters this election. So how do we continue to make gains in the Latino vote? We saw a little bit from the African American vote. How do we continue to make gains in those areas and become just a